The gravel crunched like grinding teeth under the tires of Elias's rusted sedan as they pulled up to the house. It was a skeletal thing of cedar and glass, tucked so deeply into the black wood fold that the sun seemed to give up before reaching the forest floor. Elias hopped out, his lungs filling with the sharp, cold scent of pine and damp earth, while Julian stretched, his laughter echoing too loudly against the oppressive silence of the trees. They were young, fueled by the arrogance of city boys looking for a weekend of isolation. "Listen to that," Julian grinned, throwing a heavy bag over his shoulder. "Absolute nothing. No sirens, no neighbors, just us." They spent the first hour colonizing the space, tossing sleeping bags onto dusty floorboards and cracking open beers. The house felt welcoming at first, a rustic sanctuary with a stone fireplace and wide, dark windows that looked out into the dense thicket. They shouted into the tree line just to hear the woods shout back, their voices cracking the stillness, feeling a primal surge of freedom. But as the shadows grew long and the orange hue of sunset bled into a bruised purple, the forest didn't just go quiet, it went breathless. The birds stopped mid-chirp, and the air turned unnaturally heavy, as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for the intruders to realize they weren't alone. The transition was subtle until it wasn't. They were mid-laugh, recounting a story from college when the overhead bulb in the kitchen gave a sharp, metallic ping. It dimmed to a sickly amber, pulsed twice like a dying heart, and then snapped back to full brightness. Elias froze, his hand hovering over the stove. "Old wiring," Julian muttered, though his eyes remained fixed on the ceiling. Then the first knock came. It wasn't a heavy thud, but a rhythmic, skeletal tap, tap, tap against the glass of the sliding porch door. It sounded like a fingernail, long and hardened, striking the pane. They both spun around, but the glass reflected only their own pale faces against the devouring blackness of the forest. The flickering returned, more violent now, casting the living room into strobe-like fragments of light and shadow. In those brief flashes of darkness, the woods outside seemed to press closer, the silhouettes of the trees warping into elongated limb-like shapes. Then the knocking shifted. It moved from the door to the high windows, then to the walls, a frantic skittering sound like hundreds of invisible fingers searching for a gap in the wood. "Turn it up," Elias hissed, lunging for the lamp switch. "Turn every damn light on." The light didn't bring comfort. It only illuminated their vulnerability. As every bulb in the cabin hummed with a strained, high-pitched whine, the forest outside erupted. It started as a low, guttural moan that vibrated in the floorboards, then spiraled into a cacophony of shrieks, not human, but imitating the shape of a human scream, jagged and wrong. "Julian, look at the floor," Elias whispered, his voice trembling. Deep, oily black liquid began to seep upward through the gaps in the floorboards, smelling of stagnant swamp water and old copper. It didn't pool, it crawled, moving against the grain of the wood toward their boots. Suddenly, a heavy thud shook the roof, followed by the sound of something massive dragging itself across the shingles with a wet, heavy slither. Then came the strange things. The reflections in the dark windows didn't match their movements anymore. Julian's reflection stood perfectly still, staring at the back of his real head with a wide, toothless grin. On the wall, the shadow of a chair began to elongate, growing multiple jagged limbs that reached toward Elias's shadow. The knocking on the glass turned into a frantic drumming, and just as the kitchen light shattered into a spray of glass, a pale, multi-jointed finger poked through a tiny crack in the window frame, wiggling with a sickening, rhythmic hunger. The darkness after the bulb shattered was absolute for a heartbeat, filled only by the sound of Julian's ragged breathing. When Elias clicked on his heavy-duty camping lantern, the beam cut through the gloom, revealing the finger wasn't a finger at all. It was a translucent, obsidian-hard spike that had retracted into the night. They retreated to the center of the room, backs pressed together. Outside, the forest seemed to have folded in on the house. The screams shifted from human mimicry into a rhythmic, clicking trill that vibrated in their teeth. Then, the first true glimpse of the thing appeared. It wasn't a beast of fur and claw. It was something geometric and ancient, a mythical weaver of the deep woods. Its body was a shifting mass of angular obsidian plates that floated around a central, glowing, pale violet light. It had no face, only a series of vertical slits that pulsed with each clicking sound. It stood nearly 10 feet tall on spindly, multi-jointed legs that looked like charred pine branches, yet moved with a fluid, terrifying grace. As it stepped into the light of the lantern, the very air around it warped. The wooden porch beneath its weight didn't creak, it turned to gray ash. "It's not trying to get in," Julian whimpered, pointing at the windows. "It's trying to pull the house out." The walls groaned as the nails began to screech, backing out of the wood as if drawn by a massive, unseen magnet. The mythical animal tilted its shifting, plate-like head, and 1,000 tiny eyes opened simultaneously across its limbs, all staring directly at the two friends. The house didn't collapse, it began to unmake itself. As the creature, the Viridian Weaver, stepped closer, the laws of physics seemed to dissolve. The wooden walls didn't break into splinters, they peeled away like old parchment, floating upward into the dark canopy of the forest. Elias and Julian stood on a floor that was rapidly vanishing, leaving them exposed to the freezing mountain air and the thousands of unblinking eyes that now pulsed with a rhythmic violet light. "Don't look at the center," Elias screamed, but it was too late. Julian was mesmerized by the core of the beast, his own eyes beginning to reflect that same jagged purple glow. The weaver let out one final, earth-shaking shriek, a sound that contained the history of every storm the forest had ever weathered. It lunged, not with claws, but with a sudden expansion of its obsidian plates, wrapping the entire space in a cocoon of shifting geometry. The last thing Elias saw was the house completely gone, replaced by an endless, swirling void of pine needles and starlight. When the sun finally rose over the blackwood fold, the gravel driveway was empty. There was no car, no cedar house, and no trace of the two friends, only a perfectly circular patch of gray ash where the cabin had once stood, and the faint, rhythmic tap-tap-tap of a woodpecker against a tree that shouldn't have been there.